I'm the interim director for CARE, as well as research faculty for CARE at UNH. And it's my pleasure to introduce today Dr. Bruce Martin, who is the director of applied science programs at JASCO Applied Sciences, which is headquartered in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where Bruce is calling in from today. But they're an international company focused on consulting and research in underwater acoustics. So Bruce himself has a rich history in collaborating with academic research teams across multiple industry and government sectors, and including with researchers and students here at CARE. On many topics, including soundscape measurement and modeling, as well as noise impacts on marine life. So here. Sorry about that. Oh yeah, please mute yourselves if you're not already. Thank you, appreciate that. And I'm also personally fortunate to know Bruce as an incredible mentor and collaborator from the start of my postdoc through to today. And he's going to talk to you today about some of his work and a lot about his career path. I will pass it on over to Bruce to further introduce himself and get underway. So thank you again, Bruce, for agreeing to come to this part of our CARE seminar series. Over to Bruce.
Great. Thanks, Ian. So when Ian, I guess, and Laura and Jen had approached me about providing a seminar to you folks today, is like, what the heck would I possibly talk about? And I said, well, they kind of want to hear about acoustics in industry. Seems to be a topic that hasn't been covered. So what I put together for today's talk kind of describes my career and attempts to find a few nuggets in there that I can share with you that might differentiate working with industry compared to academia and defense. Now, my career has not been normal by any stretch, and I'll kind of cover that as we go through this. But as I reflected on, I was thinking, well, the 35 years I've spent have had their twists and turns, but I think by the time most of us get to 35 years in any kind of career, there's going to be lots of interesting twists and turns. So yeah, without, I guess, further ado, I carry on and have this talk. So I think before looking at where industry fits into acoustics, I want to just take a look quickly at what I view acoustics as. And I'm going to show you two views here that I think get to the point pretty nicely. The first one is the Acoustical Society of America technical committees, which you'll normally see listed alphabetically in any kind of list or like in the programs for the meetings. But I've rearranged them here to kind of put them close together with the other committees that I view them as kind of close to, and then put computational acoustics and signal processing right in the middle. Because at the end of the day, most of what we all do is take data, process it to try and get some information out, and then learn something from that information and act on that information. So the computation and the signal processing is kind of central to everything we're doing. And then the other view here is from, it's an infographic from Salford in the UK, and it breaks down the field into three different groups. It's got the sound at the top, then impacts and applications. And it kind of breaks things down like with the sounds to say, well, here's the fundamental things that are going on. Then how does that influence things as the impacts? And then kind of what comes out to be different regions of application or industry, like making audio, whether it's a speaker or a smartphone or a loudspeaker. How about digitizing it? That's a new thing. How do you get good digital sound for instant communications like we're doing right now over the internet? Then the internet didn't support that 30 years ago, and all of a sudden here we are. And then there's the medical side, whether it's ultrasonic or hearing aids, or using ultrasound for therapy is a field that I intersected with just a little bit now, probably about 15 years ago. One of our researchers said, hey, he wanted to get into this. And we looked into it and said, well, it doesn't really fit great for us, but he really wanted to use ultrasound to break up gallstones and break up kidney stones by focusing it on those stones. And so he left JASCO and went off and is having a very fascinating career doing exactly that sort of thing. So I think the takeaway from all this is that industry fits everywhere in acoustics. And every one of us that has an education in acoustics ought to be able to find a topic that interests us, whether it's in the biology or the human factors or effects of noise and its mitigation, whether that's on humans or non-humans, it's the imaging, it's therapy. There's just so many possible aspects. There is another view of acoustics that I really wanted to show, but I couldn't find it. And it's a really neat wheel diagram that's kind of like a massive Venn diagram of where acoustics overlaps with many of the other physical sciences. And we're kind of right in the middle beside mathematics as being a highly overlapping and highly Venn diagrammed field. So we're kind of at the center of a whole lot of stuff, which makes it an exciting field. Okay, so enough about the acoustics view. What about where I came from and how I got to where I am now? Well, I didn't start off in industry. I actually started off in the Navy, the Canadian Navy. I did my undergrad in math and physics at the Royal Military College of Canada, which is like our Annapolis or West Point. And when I graduated, I was a lifer. I was going to be the head of combat systems engineering for the Navy. I was going to retire with a full pension at age 55. There's no more school except what I absolutely had to do. And I had a full head of hair. It was great. But what was I doing 33 years later? Exactly 33 years after my undergrad graduation, I was in Spain running a session at the Ocean Noise Conference on how to mitigate the effects of underwater noise from human activities. Not what I expected at all. And so how did this happen? How did I get there? And so that's what I wanted to sort of use as framing for what we're going to talk about from the rest of this presentation. So first of all, what was it that I had signed up to do right after graduation? And the Canadian Navy actually invests a heck of a lot of effort into its officers and getting them ready. And I know the US Navy does the same thing. For me, it was 3 years of training after the undergrad finished. So there was a year out in the West Coast, 6 months in the classroom, 6 months on ship, then came back to the East Coast and did 4 months with the submarine squadron and on-the-job training. Then I had some academic upgrading at Dalhousie University to take my maths and physics and give me an electrical engineering upgrade. And then 6 more months in the classroom, 6 more months on the ship, and finally ready for employment. Now, the classroom work, it had sort of two aspects. One was leadership and administration because we were officers. And then the other half was systems analysis and writing block diagrams and understanding how sensors and communications work and weapons worked. There's a lot of signal processing and a lot of systems engineering. The systems engineering especially, which taught us how to break things down into their components and how they interface to each other, I found that to be extremely valuable throughout my career, both when I was in the Navy and subsequently. And in fact, running a ship is very much a system and a team effort as well. And that's one of the things that was pretty important, I think, about the Navy years from my career. Because the ship has its sailors, it's got combat officers, it's got communicators, it's got sensor operators to run the radars and the sonars. It's got sensor technicians, it's got hull technicians, electrical technicians, weapons techs, cooks, administrators, and every one of them has that main role. But then they have 3 or 4 other roles at the same time to make the ship work. Because everybody cleans, everybody stands watch at home or in the foreign ports, they stand watch at sea, everybody loads the groceries and the ammunition, everybody's away from home together for months at a time. And so you have to learn to work as a team and get along with others so you don't have conflict constantly. Now, as a combat systems engineer, I worked closely with the technicians and learned pretty quickly that you've got to learn to listen to these guys and see what they're talking about because they are the experts. They know how does this radar actually work in not just as a whole system, but this particular radar that they're babysitting for 4 or 5 years at a time. They know it. They know how it works. And you can't tell them, well, the theory is this. Like, yeah, but this one actually has a ding in this side of the waveguide. So it doesn't work that way. So you have to learn to respect them and understand what they have and work with it. At the same time, we had the operators that we were all working with. And in this environment, this defense environment, it's different than anything else. But there's a key lesson there for industry too, which is that help is best defined by those who need the help, which is similar to listen to your customers. The customer is always right. And for the operators, it means we had to listen to what they wanted, what they needed, how they wanted information presented so that they could make decisions on whether a ship or submarine was there. But at the same time, we quickly learned that these guys know what they want from what they've been trained, not necessarily from being innovators. So the technicians and the engineers, they're still the innovators. They still need those skills to come up with a new system to work with. And on that note, this ship, the 233, which has long since been decommissioned, the HMCS Fraser, that I was on for the last 6 months, happened to be the ship where the Navy had fitted ETAS, which was the Experimental Towed Array Sonar System. And this system absolutely fascinated me. I like going back there to their dark lab when we were at sea, and seeing how they were looking at all these squiggly green lines on a super high def screen move up and down and give them guidance on what was a ship or a submarine. This was cutting edge technology. And as an added bonus, we were having great success against US submarines without being detected ourselves. So that was kind of fun from a war games point of view, but also it just showed me that there is real technology here that would be fascinating to work with. So when I finished those 3 years, I then asked to be posted to what was at the time Defense Research Establishment Atlantic, now called Defense Research and Development Canada Atlantic Center, and spent 3 years there. I was working with scientists and technicians who were building prototype active and passive sonars and learning how to do it in order to write specifications so that Canada could purchase the next generation systems. I was helping collect and analyze data and then writing contracts to different contractors around Halifax to get support for things we couldn't do internally. Along the way, DRDC supported myself and several others in doing academic upgrading. Which was in the form of DSP courses at Dalhousie, but also I got to spend a summer at Penn State and learned a couple of underwater acoustics and random variables courses there. As part of the work at Dal, I met a really neat professor named Barry Payton from the physics department, who had one of those really eclectic labs. At the time, he was doing laser physics, data communications, MRIs. He had a computer network in 1993, which was unheard of, and was working on a phone that could send emails. So a really neat guy. Unfortunately, he didn't strike gold with the phone that could send email, but that's the kind of stuff he was interested in. And he had a support from a company called IoTech to develop communications and digital signal processing ideas to be part of that ETAS system that I'd seen on the Fraser. So because of my interest in that, I wound up getting 8 months off in the middle of my time at DRDC to finish an MSc with Dr. Payton. That was primarily coursework, but also a thesis project that was not published, but it was a scan and lock laser data link where we demonstrated low bandwidth comms on a laser across a 2-kilometer lake. So much for not doing any more education and being a lifer who's interested in the Navy. I was getting really deep into this idea of science and technology and sensing. As it happened, when I finished those 3 years at DRDC, I was the beneficiary of something called the Force Reduction Program, which was, the Canadian government looking for a windfall after the end of the Cold War. So they were downsizing by about 40% most of the armed forces, and so they essentially paid us to leave and go get jobs in industry. And so I was hired by IoTech based on my MSc work. I spent the next 2 years building a sniper detection system and trialing it, and then 2 more years working on a SOSIS processing system, which is the cabled hydrophones that sit on the bottom of the ocean listening for Russian submarines. At the same time, I was doing quite a bit of work supporting proposals. So during the field work, for instance, for the snipers, it was a very humbling experience to be out at CFB Gagetown, which is a large Army base in New Brunswick, sort of almost directly north of you guys. And so you felt very small with tanks and helicopters and big trucks buzzing around, where all these folks knew what they needed to do. They didn't have time for anything that didn't work well and just wanted to get on with the job. They couldn't tolerate false alarms. They needed things to be right all the time, but they also couldn't tolerate false negatives. They couldn't afford for people to miss the detection. And in order to make such a system work and work reliably, we had to respect their interests, but we also had to have a lot of continuity. So we had to document everything we were doing so the system could be turned over to other developers. And in fact, other people took it over while I was at MDA. So I spent 2 years and I was transferred to the SOSIS project, and other people took over the system I designed and made it work on tanks and made it work on trucks and made it work on helmets. So that was a very interesting part of it. And the other thing that was interesting, again, is starting to work on proposals and being educated on this fact that everybody in a company has to help with business development, or there's no funds available to do the interesting work. So they are learning how to understand what people wanted and to come up with the design was part of what I was learning when I was at MDA. MDA had bought IoTech right after I got there. I only stayed at MDA for 4 years because of a sort of another interesting lesson learned, which is that sometimes companies will team with each other and not really mean it. So in this case, MDA had teamed with General Dynamics in order to get 20% of a project called TIAPS, which stood for Towed Integrated Active Passive Sonar, which I was really excited to work on. It was the next ETAS thing. But it turned out that GD was not having any interest in providing any funds to MDA. They viewed them as a competitor that they didn't want to have anything to do with. So after a bunch of harassing of the guy who was in charge at GD, he said, look, if you want to work on it, that'd be great, but you have to leave MDA and work for General Dynamics. So I did. My experience has been that smaller companies will often work better together than the big guys, but that's not a hard and fast rule, and it's a case-by-case thing. So 7 years at General Dynamics, lots of signal processing and writing software for user interfaces for active and passive sonar systems to detect vessels and submarines and torpedoes. And we would go to sea every 18 months or so on Navy ships where we fit the prototype software or systems right on board. So we were working in parallel with the real systems. So we didn't impact the ability for the ship to do its business, but we could also compare what we were seeing on more modern platforms to what they were seeing on the production systems. And it was going really well. We'd come up with a lot of good ideas, a lot of improved processing that was eventually wrapped into a proposal that was accepted by the government. That was back in like the concepts we were working on in 2003, 4, 5, 6 turned into a contract that finally got let in 2017. And in fact, we're still working with General Dynamics at JASCO right now to finish implementing it in 2025. So another interesting lesson learned on industry and defense of just how long these procurement cycles are to go from concept in 2002 and finally into production in 2025. Another interesting lesson learned on that one is I was, by 2007, I was one of the team leads working on a torpedo defense system. And the new manager that we'd gotten transplanted in from Ottawa was giving the team a pretty hard time about some stuff in reports that was just not true. Like we were doing a reasonable job, but they were saying it wasn't. And there was a lot of conflict there. There's already a fair amount of conflict because the headquarters in Ottawa, where production stuff was done, was just sort of taking all of our ideas and all of our revenue into a black box and not letting us do any improvements and research on our own. So I was having a fair amount of challenges there. And so after the blowout with the manager in Halifax, I sent an email saying, look, guys, it's been fun, but in 5 months when this current project is done, I'm going to strike out on my own and work directly for defense research as soon as I can get a contract. And that was kind of cool. That caused a manager from Ottawa to be here the next morning. He sat down with me for breakfast, and by the time breakfast was over, he had requested I turn in my cell phone and my computer. And because I said I was going to compete with them, they didn't owe me anything for my 7 years of good service, and I was gone on 2 weeks' notice. So, you do have to be a little careful of what you say. Honesty can not necessarily be the best policy all the way through an industry career in some cases. So, yeah, just you have to be a little bit careful for yourself, especially with these big companies. Now, as I was saying that we're doing trials, some of them were down at a place called Exuma Sound or Tongue of the Ocean. And that's shown here on the left. It's in the Bahamas. It's an amazing place to do sonar trials, because especially this one here on the left, this is Tongue of the Ocean. It looks kind of like a tongue if you cut it out of the body. And it's this deep, like 1,300 meter deep canyon that's surrounded by atolls and reefs on all sides. So there's almost no noise in there except for local wind, and it's the Bahamas, so there's almost no wind except in a hurricane. So it's dead quiet, perfect place for doing trials. Now, on the Ides of March, the actual 15th of March, 2000, one of the, I think it was an Arleigh Burke class destroyers, cruisers, from the US here, came out of Tongue of the Ocean with its SQS 53 Charlie sonar pinging away. And that's what this picture is here, is the bulb from that sonar. And you can see the crew of installers in front of it. This thing is huge. It puts out an enormous amount of power. And what is believed to have happened is it came out of Tongue of the Ocean, turned the corner into this canyon heading out between the different reefs, and the sudden increase in sound was so bad that it stunned and damaged the hearing on, I think it was 35 or 40 porpoises and beaked whales that washed up over the next 24 hours because they were killed along or so harassed that they couldn't properly navigate anymore all along the shallows here in the archipelago. So that kicked off a huge amount of research that becomes relevant when you start talking about my work here in JASCO. A huge amount of research by the Office of Naval Research. And there's already some indications by that point of the amount of damage that sound could do through some work that was being done in Alaska on bowheads, as well as simple fact that near construction sites or dynamite fishing, fish are stunned and killed. So marine life cared about sound was becoming some pretty key information. The research that was being done by that point was also showing that impulsive noise sources were a bigger problem than continuous ones, both because of the fact that they're impulsive, but also because of the fact that they're so loud. So what I'm showing here is a pile driving operation used to install wind turbines. And piles are tubes that are hammered into the ground. If you're building a pier or a bridge, you'll typically use fairly small piles, like 1 or 2 meters, maybe 3. But for wind turbines, they're using 8, 10, 12, and they're even talking about 15-meter piles now. So that's 15 meters in diameter being hammered with, I think it's 4 or 5 megajoule hammers for 4 or 5 hours at a time. And that can be heard hundreds of kilometers away, and it can do damage in multiple kilometers, especially to the hearing of marine mammals. To give you a scale of the operation, this is the compressor bar or compressor ship. So it's got 24 compressors on it, all generating air going through bubble curtains all the way around the pile. So that's what these rings are. They're bubbles to reflect sound. And then you have about a 250-meter ship doing the actual installation. So this is a huge operation. The other big sound that's of concern is seismic surveys. I mean, sonar is, but these pile drivers and seismic surveys are an even bigger deal. So again, this is a 100-meter ship up here in the top right. A couple of 100 meters behind it, it has an air gun sound source, which is generating large bubbles of air every 30 seconds or so. There's 2 of them, so it's every 15. Those bubbles are noise or sound at like equivalent of 250 decibels, which is enormously loud. It goes down, reflects off layers in the seabed, and then all these other little dashes of a wake here, those are the head buoys for towed arrays. They're about 100 meters apart laterally, and they each stretch back 8 to 12 kilometers. So this is an unbelievably large marine operation. And that kind of a cool thing is acousticians are all over this stuff. They're acousticians working with geologists to understand what's bouncing off. You got acousticians designing the beam patterns for the sources. You got acousticians designing the noise mitigation for the pile driving over here. So there's people involved in all stages of this. What often happens in these large operations, whether it's sonar, pile driving, or seismic, is that academics do the initial work to understand what the effects are and how they can be mitigated and what needs to be done and when it's a problem. That will inform regulations in general that are passed up to government. The government then makes requirements on the proponents of any new project for what they have to do to mitigate the sound or to understand it. But those kind of mitigations and monitoring are really best done by industry because of the scale and how fast things have to be done. So, there's an onus on industry then to turn around, though, and collect more data while they're doing these operations and passing it back to inform the regulations to make them better. So after that segue, my ignoble end at General Dynamics was the start of a great 18 years so far at JASCO. As it turned out, somebody that I had gone through Navy training with had opened a JASCO office in Halifax, and they needed some help with signal processing. So JASCO had been contracted by Shell to work in the Chukchi Sea, north of Alaska, which is between the Bering and the Beaufort, to analyze sound data, to understand where mammals were, marine mammals, and what was the soundscape in terms of how loud was the area without seismic surveys, and they had run a seismic survey as well. So this is in 2007. There were 17 recorders scattered across the Chukchi with about 4 months of data each. And so JASCO didn't really have any way to process the data when I came along. And so it was a perfect opportunity for me to be involved. I showed up right around the same time the recorder data came back. And I happened to know how to detect things like ships and submarines and how to process large data sets. So it seemed like a good match. But quickly understood that I have no idea what a walrus sounds like. And very few other people did in 2007 either, or a bowhead or a beluga. I actually had no idea how to compute a micropascal either, because in the Navy, we didn't care about noise per se. We just cared about detection. Looking back, that was a big mistake. We should have, but at the time we didn't. So there's a lot to learn. And I also got to learn about things like walruses. So a little segue, you can't say what does a walrus sound like and not actually show it. So hopefully you guys are hearing these funky sounds from the walrus. There's grunts and there's the knocking sounds and then the bell-like sound. So what I was used to for detecting was very structured sounds, like those made by different kinds of sonars or by tonal machinery rotating. But these weren't that. These were very amorphous, and you couldn't just filter them or come up with the perfect FFT to do the job. So in order to understand them, had to get my hands dirty, so to speak. I had to get in there and look at the data, listen to it, experiment with different ways of detecting it. And as a result, built the first versions of our PAMLab software to do that looking and listening. We're still using it today to do that and a whole lot more. Today, we might have started that in Python, but in the time, Java was the name of the game. And it's still going strong. So we run the Java on our desktops, we run it on our high-performance compute cluster, and we run it on embedded processing that we run on autonomous vehicles. It really is a write once, run everywhere. And that duration, that longevity is another thing that really distinguishes what happens in industry versus what happens in academia. So, in academia, the software will rarely last past 1 or 2 students. So you write your code to do your particular project. You may pass it on to the next student, but the odds are it wasn't really well documented. And the next student says, well, I like working in Julia instead of Python anyway. So they write their own, which is good. It's all part of the learning process. But in industry, you can't afford to do that. You have to test it, you have to document it, you have to have it stable. And so there's this continuous evolution of a particular project instead of making a whole bunch of new ones. Okay. And the other thing that came out of this project was a real start to an understanding of risk. So risk is probability times consequence. And for JASCO, this 2007 program, it started in March. We got the starting gun to have 17 recorders in the Chukchi by July. Now, we didn't have 17 recorders on the shelf. We never designed that kind of a mooring before. So we had to pull together equipment to make a float in the rope type mooring. With our limited experience and the long lead times, we had no time to test. And we assembled a system that had an acoustic release, a recorder from a company called MTE in Quebec. Both of those worked great. And then we put some trawl floats around the recorder in order to lift it once the acoustic release triggered. So there's a weight, the release, the floating recorder, and then the floats would bring it up when you hit the release. The lowest cost item in that system was those trawl floats that were supposed to bring the recorders back up to the surface. And as it turned out, there was a manufacturing defect in that batch. Around 25% of them leaked. But we needed all 4 of them that were on it to bring the thing to the surface. So I think it was 2 of them that made it back of the 17. The other 15 had flooded and were sitting on the bottom. So JASCO had to pay for ROV retrievals. Fortunately, Shell was willing to pay for a ship that they already had up there doing some work to take us out, but we had to pay for the ROVs and the extra time. But we got the data back, and that's the critical thing. But because of that extra expense, we certainly made no money that year. There's all kinds of types of risks that you have to deal with in industry, and learning how to mitigate them and how to prioritize them is part of the game. The biggest one and the most important one by far is the human risk during field operations. And the level of health and safety that gets applied to industrial operations is way beyond anything I ever encountered in academia or in defense. And sometimes when I'm working, it happened with UNH and it happened with Dalhousie. You point out that, hey guys, you really should send your students for some training here before you send them to sea. They, oh yeah, you know what, that's probably a good idea, but it just isn't part of the natural sequence of things. Say going out on a UNO ship, you don't all have to have cold water survival training. We always have to mitigate equipment damage and loss. You have to mitigate cyber. That's a big deal these days. We had a horrible cyber incident in July and August. We had all kinds of mitigations in place, and they did catch the problem, but not before a certain amount of our data had leaked and gotten onto the dark web. You have to mitigate risk from your reputation being damaged. You can't send just any person out to represent the company in the field or to a conference. You have to have people who are going to do the right kind of representation of the company. I know there's always financial risk. So, whenever you make a decision, you do have to look at the likelihood of something going wrong, the possible consequences, and determine how to mitigate those risks. In the Chukchi program, we had quite a few cases where we may or may not have done a great job of mitigating that. Obviously, the first year. The second year, we made our own recorders, but we didn't know for sure how well they're going to work. So we had the recorder, which is all this gray stuff. We put one of the known working recorders from the previous year into the system to mitigate any possible risk. And it turned out there was a risk. The discs we had in these tubes couldn't handle the cold, so most of them seized up and didn't work. But the ones that we had on top for risk mitigation and half the stations did work. So we continue to learn, we continue to change how we did things in order to minimize the risk, minimize the cost, but also to improve the performance. This is a very similar system to the one that leaked, except we had higher quality floats involved in it. But this was a special purpose recorder that we really trusted, that we used for very specific sound source verifications because we didn't trust our own equipment yet. By the time our own equipment was good enough, that we swapped it out. This was a very big program. We had anywhere from 5 to 15 recorders in the water from 2007 to 2015 in the winter, and 17 to 45 of them in the water in the summer. And as a result of that, we established an Arctic pedigree for doing research, and we're able to get involved with more and more complex systems for research. For instance, the system we've got here that went out in 2017 in the Beaufort as a vertical line array for a multi-institutional trial. In 2019, 2020, we built this drifting vertical array that went out over winter and drifted with the pack ice in the Beaufort as, again, a part of a multi-institutional trial, doing tomography. We've recently bought a company that makes the sea ice mass balance buoy. So you drill it into the ice, and then it uses ultrasound to measure ice and snow and radio the data back. And we've coupled the lessons learned from these two different systems to build this drifting spar buoy, which is going to go out probably in the winter of 26, 27 into the Arctic to drift along and do real-time detection of sounds. And it's got a really cool system that we've designed to allow users in the field to couple the different sections of this thing together so that it can be coupled in the Arctic with gloves on or mitts on, and not having to have people take their mitts off to join all the electrical and mechanical connections. Now, one of the things I have noticed in the last few years as we've gotten into some of this more interesting stuff is that if you want to scale up in industry and move fast, you really need to talk to the money guys, to those venture capitalists, to get the cash you need to do things quickly. JASCO hasn't done that, but we've seen other companies sort of sprint past us in their capabilities because they have the money to do it. And a couple that come to mind are Thayer Mahan, who is operating in the East Coast just like we are on wind turbine stuff, but they've got a 32 element vertical or horizontal line array they've been able to convince people to use, which is more capable and much more expensive than the stuff we're proposing. And then another company that's appearing in Europe called Helsing that has all kinds of money and is into drones. And so they've provided something like 10,000 drones to the Ukrainian conflict, and are now trying to get into putting acoustics on gliders in order to do underwater sound patrol. And so that is definitely a conflicting sort of thing that I've noticed is, in order to really go fast, you have to sell your soul to these venture capitalists. And I'm not sure if that's good, bad, or indifferent yet, but I do know that it makes a difference. All right, so I had all this data from the Chukchi program and wanted to make sure we were using it to provide good value to our clients. And the initial stuff we were doing was like, well, that's nice, but there's got to be something more. So I was going to conferences as often as I could to present my half-baked ideas on some of the stuff and listen to what other folks had going on, and met a great selection of people who were like-minded, and people like Jen and Dave Barclay and Holger Klink, Aaron Thoden, Christine Urbe, and even Ian. Like some of the presentations I saw of Ian's were like, wow, he's doing some great stuff, and I had to go and talk to him. But if I'm asking all these questions and interested in all these things, there's a serious risk that I'm going to wind up doing a PhD. And in fact, I did get interested in that and talked to Jen about working with her, but with a job and a family, I couldn't do a year of residency at UNH. But then Dave Barclay showed up at Dalhousie, and so I went to be his first PhD student from 2015 to 2019. Now, I had a really free-flow PhD program because I had my own questions, I had my own data, and I had funding, because JASCO covered the cost of my tuition and books, which is pretty common as far as I can tell. Like most companies will help support courses and degrees for their employees in order to improve their capacities in exchange for a period of service afterwards. As it turned out, I didn't take time off. I kept working, but that was only possible because my wife was working as a paramedic. And so she was working every other weekend, which was the same weekend that our kids were with their other parents. So it was long nights, but it was worth it to satisfy my curiosity. It made absolutely no difference to my job description, responsibilities, or remuneration. But like I said, I've had a very nonlinear, non-traditional journey. My original idea for the PhD was to explore and demonstrate passive acoustic metrics for describing ecosystems. But the first thing that I had thought I'd work on got scooped by another team and published. And so I kept experimenting while doing classes and leaning towards the conclusion that these metrics, at least as they're defined at the time, were not going to solve the ecosystem description problem. And part of that came from a session that Jen and I did in the 2017 Ocean Noise on metrics and what were they good for. Is that going to play? There we go. What are they good for? Absolutely nothing. Bad tricks. What are they good for? Absolutely something. Bad tricks. What are they good for? Absolutely everything. So that brings us to the UNH program. So starting in 2016, I've been working with Jen and UNH on a series of programs, and the first one being ADION. So Jen was putting together this multidisciplinary team with active acoustics and data visualizations and modeling and standards to look at the ecosystem, the acoustic ecosystem up and down the East Coast of the US. And so we had landers that we were deploying all the way from Virginia down to the Blake Escarpment off of Florida. And we went up and down the coast and across the coast. Jen had originally approached Cornell, Holger Klink, to provide the passive acoustics, but he was too busy at the time, and it wasn't directly in the line of the kind of research he was doing. So he said, well, why don't you call Bruce at JASCO? So we got to be part of this team. And one of the big innovations that we came up with on this was the ALTO lander, or Autonomous Long-Term Observatory Lander, which integrates hydrophones, and we chose to go with 4 hydrophones so we could give directional information, a conductivity dissolved oxygen logger, a satellite iridium beacon for retrieval, a flasher to see the system for retrieval. There's 2 acoustic releases inside this thing. There is a fish tag logger from Vemco, and then there is an AZFP or a WBAT echo sounder system. So we built this thing so we could put all these sensors on it and easily deploy it in the Gulf Stream. Most of the systems that have been deployed in the Gulf Stream previously, even if they're just single autonomous recorders for acoustics, there's like a 80% retrieval rate because it's such a high energy environment. We got all of them back. Now, 2 of them needed a little bit of assistance to get them back after I think we had 30 deployments total in this area. This one here got run over by a sand wave, moving sand wave. And so it got buried, and we had to dig it out with an ROV. So as it turned out, that particular trial, the ROV Jason was on board the Armstrong. And so she used her thrusters and cleared this thing up, and we got it back. It was interesting to see it had become its own little reef. There's a fish sitting up here. There's all kinds of sea stars that were on it as well. And the other one, there was a miswiring of part of the mooring retrieval system, but Jason was able to go down and cut the rope that got stuck, and we got it back. This thing has been hit by trawls a number of times, especially at Virginia. And every time it either redeploys itself right side up onto the seabed, or we get it retrieved in the fishermen's nets, and then the iridium beacon goes off and we are able to go get it. So a really great platform to work with, I think. It's been continued to use in the follow-on programs. One of the really, I think, important things that we did and that Jen led in ADION was the idea of standardization. And so one of the things that we did right away in 2017 was define a soundscape specification, saying, if you're going to go and collect sound, here's how you should report it. Here's how you collect it, here's how you report it. And decades, which is an old third of an octave, is a bandwidth that's been recommended and to provide statistics every minute. And then take those statistics and plot them and analyze them over periods of weeks or months. And so this is a very busy plot, but what it allows us to do is look at key frequencies and go in and see how does the intensity of sound change over time and by position. And I could dissect this for another full hour on stuff, and we can talk about it anytime you want, because I love this stuff. But I think this is one of the great innovations that we had on ADION. It wound up turning around into an ISO standard just this year. But so ISO standard 7605 is pretty much the ADION soundscape spec with a little bit of refinement from a subsequent program in Europe. We spent quite a bit of time worrying about and looking into what the marine mammals are across the outer continental shelf. And so this is a summary by month of confirmed presence. We spent quite a bit of time tweaking and improving our detectors as well as our analysis methods throughout the program to come up with this kind of display. I think key things that we found were that minke whales, if I can just go back to the map, minke whales hang out in this area in the wintertime. We never really knew where their mating and breeding grounds were, but this program showed, yep, it's pretty much right here. The other thing that we're able to really show that was new is the presence of two different kinds of beaked whales. So there's one that was hanging out here, which was if I got it right, I think it was Trues and Gervais, and then Blainesvilles were hanging out down at this space. So that's new information that we didn't have. All kinds of subtle information about presence and movement of whales also came out from the other species, but those were the two big new ones. And then finally, metrics. Well, you know what? Turns out they are good for something if you ask the right question. So I worked with Jen and a student of hers at UNH called Dylan Wilford, and we came up with a suite of 4 metrics, which were amplitude, impulsiveness, uniformity, and periodicity. And those 4, when you combine them in a soundscape code, which is a lot like an ice egg, for those who work with ice eggs, you might be familiar with them, allowed us to separate 5 different soundscapes that we want to look at. The 2 most dramatic being over here, RH, which is a deep water, cold water coral reef, and the Great Barrier Reef. And you can see that the colors here are pretty much flipped all the way across because the metrics are just showing a completely different thing. So what people were trying to do with metrics in 2015, 16, 17 didn't work because they're asking the wrong question. But this turned out to work, and it was, I think, a really fun success. Speaking of success, there's successors to ADION, with the first one being AEON, which is 3 more years of recording in the Gulf of Maine and established a baseline for the Gulf of Maine. We also added a wire walker with Doug Vandermark. And then Gomran was the next successor. That's 2 more years of recording, and it's being followed by Smart Acoustics. AEON didn't particularly have much science in it, but Gomran and Smart Acoustics do. So I'm going to talk a bit about one of those real quick. So in Gomran, Jen and I had some thoughts on how to use the directional acoustics, and we're finally really getting a handle on how to do that. And by using bearings to calls and counting the number of unique bearings over a short period of time, we're getting a minimum number of animals present. So Emma Vergau is using that in her thesis. I've just submitted a methods paper on how it's working, and she's using it to get the results to look at the distribution of sei whales for the first time. Really good information on that, to scatter and how they're scattered around the Gulf of Maine. There was an adion derivative that was something we were working on in 2022, especially. We had a workshop on how to model soundscapes. So one of the things that really like blew my mind, and hadn't thought of it before until the adion workshops where we were figuring out how to run the program, is if you want to know the soundscape between recording locations, you can't really just extrapolate what you measured. You have to do modeling. You have to do modeling for wind and you have to do modeling for vessels because the vessels are moving. So this idea of modeling a soundscape has become something that is a big part of soundscapes these days. Both on adion and then a subsequent program in Europe both did that. And so in 2022, we had a group of 8 different international research teams come together and talk about how to model wind and vessels. And what we found is that we had to come up with some agreements on what times and what spatial resolutions to use, and that was expected. What we didn't expect was how bad we all were at modeling wind. So there's actually 3 papers that came out on how to do a better job of modeling wind. One of those I was leading, and it came up with a new source dipole model for wind based on an analysis of a whole bunch of data sets, of which 8 were from adion and 3, I think, were from aeon. And what we are able to do now by combining this new dipole model with a sound propagation model of Martin Siderius's that incorporates sound speed profiles, bottom properties, and sensor and receiver depths or bottom depths, we can actually do a really sweet job of predicting just how loud is the wind going to be as a function of wind speed. And you can see that for a particular quarter here, where blue is the satellite data and orange is what we predict. So we can do that, but really cool is you can turn it around. And if you have the wind from the satellite, you can actually estimate what are the sediment properties, which is a pretty clever new, I have to say, new approach. And it's all been open sourced and it's available in the Open Acoustics library. So why have I told you about these? Well, I won't lie, I think they're pretty cool. But more importantly, in order for JASCO to stay relevant and attract new collaborators and customers, we have to stay at the forefront of the field. So we have to be able to do this research and advance the science. In academia, you're going to find it's publish or perish. In industry, it's innovate or perish. This is also an example that there is a lot of room in industry to keep yourself engaged in R&D, author papers, and attend conferences. So the last thing I want to point out is there's a Gomran asset called the underwater listening system that's being deployed 10 kilometers off of Shoals Marine Lab. It will be the world's first solar-powered underwater listening system, which is pretty neat. And it will have directional passive acoustics. It'll have an echo sounder, an EDCP camera, fisheye logger, conductivity dissolved oxygen. And it's connected to a fiber, and we're trying to get a permanent installation of a distributed acoustic sensing system, which is a whole new field that's pretty sweet of doing acoustics with fiber optics. And it should go live this weekend. I think they load up on Wednesday or Thursday, Friday, deploy Saturday, Sunday. And by the time middle of next term comes around, it should be live on the UNH websites. So this project is another example of where risk is a big factor. So all the critical elements on this thing are dual redundant. There's 2 sets of hydrophones, there's 2 sets of modems, there's 2 sets of fibers. There's a mud mat we installed just to make sure that it doesn't sink into the mud. We're not sure that it would, but we put the mud mat on to be sure. And so you have to, this is definitely a case where, risk is worth it. Getting the thing in out of the water is so expensive that you do as much as you can to avoid that. So this system should become a cornerstone for research and health monitoring in the Gulf of Maine. And I really do look forward to seeing what you all do with that data as it starts coming in. So a little bit long, but I think we still have some time for questions. Thanks for your interest.
Round of applause for Bruce. Thank you so much, Bruce, again for coming to speak for this seminar. That was a really exciting talk to learn about your journey and all the cool work you've been involved with up to today. So we do have 8 minutes or so for questions. So open to questions. Feel free to put them in the chat and also unmute yourself if you're online and have a question as well.
There's a question.
Oh yeah, we do have a question from the chat, which I can read out from Rahul. I completed a PhD in physical acoustics application for fracture predictions of snow. I wish to move towards this field potentially with the support of industry, and they're looking for any suggestions.
Neat. Well, I think the obvious answer would be find yourself a good postdoc that's in underwater acoustics to get you started. Yeah, I know within Canada, Dalhousie, they have the Ocean Frontiers Institute often has calls for postdocs, and Dave Barclay sometimes is looking for them, as well as Sarah Fortune. They would both be interested in this kind of thing. Or Maycedo is another one. Of course, ONR, Woods Hole, they're also organizations. Scripps is another one that all have postdocs that can get you going in this kind of field. Within Canada, we have a program called MyTax that has a postdoc field. Now, I don't know. We're not currently thinking of going down that path right now, but there may be other companies that are. So there are definitely options, but I would say postdoc would be your next step to get into this field.
All right, John is raised. Go ahead.
Hey, Bruce, that was a lot of fun. I think a great talk for people to see that the path through industry can often be a little bit squirrely. I liked when you were talking about the idea of risk and the sort of probability and cost, but that's a very static model. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on time scale and sort of long-term, short-term payoffs, and how you think about that when you think about projects as well. That's sort of an element of
For sure it is. Yeah. It's very rare that a project has heaps of time so that you can do the engineering you need to do and make sure everything on time side is risk-free. So for instance, like connectors and cables are often something that kills us for time. So if we see something coming, but it's not contracted yet, we'll often take the risk and just go buy it. That's a very minor thing, but it's a huge risk savings later for hitting your delivery dates. It's been a lot of fun working with UNH. Jen gets this stuff, so she'll give us the time to do it right a lot of the time. So you work it into your project plans when you can, and working with your collaborators, your customers, saying, look, this is going to take this much time. Give me 2 months more than that, and we'll be sure that we get it right. But when you can't, then it's often you have to exchange cost for schedule. That's often what it comes into. If you're not going to have enough schedule, then you have to spend more money in order to accelerate how fast you get stuff done. So I'm not sure if that quite answered what you're looking for. But
it kind of does, but also the other thing that triggered that was you were talking about the year where you guys had to spend a bunch of what would have been your profit to go get stuff back, but in the long term, it was probably worth it. And it seems that there's a sort of loss leader decision.
It was a loss leader very much of if you don't do this, the work's not going to keep going. You have to show that you're committed to the program and you're committed to the client. You're going to do what it takes to answer their questions. Yeah, for sure.
And Bruce, I'll just add on to that. The JASCO invested a lot of their own money in the development of the lander that we used for Adeon. And then that went on to benefit their company in projects all around the world. So oftentimes there's an investment by the company to make good on a contract or an award that they have, but there is a lot of opportunity for business returns from that development.
Yeah, and that does lead to something that's pretty unique in my experience so far anyway, about JASCO is, we are not owned by venture capitalists. We're not owned by people who are key on, I have to get this money back 10% every year. We are more science oriented and service oriented. So we invest like 25% of our revenues every year back into product development or science development or conferences. So we're able to make those decisions, say, okay, here's what we need next, and go and do it. Laura's got her hand up.
Yep, go ahead, Laura.
And you're muted. Laura, you're muted. Laura, you're muted.
There we go. Are we good now?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just trying to connect to the school's projector for some reason. I said that was great. I had a similar question to John on risk, but it's kind of on a different level. I really appreciated you talking about the different levels of risk. I think that's something that we don't really talk about, especially with fieldwork and with the costs of fieldwork and thinking of all the different factors that go into it. And as someone who's always thinking about this, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the non-technical aspects of risk in terms of, you had a mention of putting all these people on vessels when you can't necessarily be there, and to control how you can try to anticipate some of what would come out from that. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit more on how often you go out to sea, how long those deployments are, and if there's any sort of training or considerations that JASCO does to help with some of the inherent personnel complications that might arise in fieldwork.
For sure. Yeah, it's a huge element of our business, is that health and safety side and the personnel field training side. So we probably have 24 people that are field trained out of the 130 that work for JASCO. And they will start by getting first a medical certificate. So, make sure they're master mariner certified to go to sea. And then they will get the cold water survival training, helicopter evacuation training. So there's places, on both coasts where you can get that training. So that's the first thing. They have to have that, and first aid. So they have to have all that training to begin with. So that's the baseline. Then we have a internal program for learning the seamanship and the acoustics and the mooring side of things. So how do you do all that? It's a online based training, followed by mentoring at sea. So you don't go to sea on your own at first. You have to go out with people who are qualified. The two leads we have right now for that work are Emily Maxner here in Halifax and Carmen Lawrence. Well, actually, Rob Mills is doing it right now, but as soon as she's back, it'll be Carmen, who's been to sea numerous times with the ADOT team. And so, they're just level-headed people, they're great people as well. So they are responsible for assessing the new folks and finding out what their dispositions are like. Do they get seasick? Do they get, overly hangry? Are they the kind of people that aren't good team players? And if they're not, then you have to choose where they go to sea. They can go to sea once in a while as a supporting role, but you're not going to send them out as a lead, because it's not fair to the client to have somebody out there who's not going to work hard and be a team player, and also be able to think on their feet, say, okay, if this isn't working, what's next? What can we get out there and do? And it takes some time to learn who the right people are for that. And sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you have to recalibrate and go back. But then that's the internal personnel side. But our health and safety program has been based on what is needed by contract with the oil and gas companies, especially. They take health and safety to the max. So we have to make sure we have the right personal equipment, the right standards for when to put it on, the right standards for how to test it, make sure it's still certified, and then run the right program. So you have to have a toolbox meeting before each operation. You have to do job safety analysis before each meeting, daily toolbox meetings, behavior-based reporting. So you have to go back after each one and do reporting on how each operation went. And did the behaviors work out? Did the ship work out? Is the ship's crew helpful? Would we ever use that ship again? That kind of stuff. It's a very involved and nice spiral feedback loops to make sure that things stay safe and get safer.
We are a couple minutes over time, so Bruce, I want to be respectful of your time, but just want to do one more round of applause. Thank Bruce again for presenting today. And Bruce, if folks want to get in touch with you for any further questions, A, is that okay? And
yep.
B, so how should they reach out to you?
So Ian's got my email, Jen's got my email, Laura does. So bruce.martin@jasco.com. It's very cryptic that way. And so, please reach out, and, happy to talk about doing projects. Or I saw a question came up again about the industry postdocs. Yes, that does happen from time to time. I don't know of any that are open right now. But if you had a good idea, then bring it to us and we'll see what we can do.
All right. Thank you so much again, Bruce, and thank you everyone online and in the room who has attended, and have a great rest of your Monday.
Thanks, folks.